They didn't warn us. They didn't explain. They just turned off the machines and walked away. In Windsor, Ontario, the silence hit first. Then came Michigan, then Illinois. One by one, Stellantis shut down factories and fired thousands, blaming tariffs. But here's the part they're not telling you. The shutdowns were already planned. The tariffs were just the cover. Behind every closed plant is a shattered family. Behind every press conference is a lie. Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep. The collapse is accelerating and no one's coming to stop it. So ask yourself, what happens when jobs disappear overnight? When your dealership has nothing left to sell? When the brands you grew up with just vanish? What's happening? As the media scrambled to decode the shutdown, Stellantis executives pointed the finger squarely at Washington. Trump's 25% tariffs, they claimed, had made production in North America too expensive. The plant couldn't stay open, they said. It wasn't their fault. They were victims of policy, victims of trade war. But leaked documents told another story entirely. Internal memos and strategy briefs, dated months before the tariff hikes, revealed a far more calculated plan. Stellantis had been preparing to gut its North American operations long before any tariff hit the books. They had scouted new sites overseas, begun terminating supplier contracts, and initiated quiet buyouts of veteran employees. The tariffs didn't cause the shutdown. They gave the company the perfect excuse to execute it. One email chain from a top executive in Milan said it best: "Tariffs provide us political cover. We can reposition without PR blowback." This wasn't an economic strategy. It was corporate theater. They weaponized a policy crisis to do what they had always planned to do: leave. And they weren't alone. In the shadows of the Stellantis exodus, other automakers were drawing the same blueprint. Use tariffs to justify closures, blame regulators, then quietly move production to lower-cost countries, while public outrage stays distracted. It was betrayal wrapped in bureaucratic language. But the next betrayal, it would be even more personal. It would come not from boardrooms or politicians, but from the people workers trusted the most. The union that never saw it coming. Labor unions had been the last firewall between workers and corporate greed. They negotiated contracts. They fought for benefits. They rallied when factories were on the brink. But when Stellantis shut the gates in Windsor, union leaders found themselves staring into the abyss, with nothing to offer but apologies. One union rep, speaking through tears at a press conference, admitted what many feared: "We didn't see it coming. They lied to our faces." Another, more stoic, said only, "They used us." In private, the anger boiled. Members flooded union halls, demanding answers. Why weren't there warning signs? Why weren't stronger protections in place? Why were promises of new investment and modernization now proven false? The answers never came, because the unions didn't have them. Stellantis had played them, pitched investments, promised hybrid production lines, secured contract extensions, then pulled the plug once the ink was dry. What followed was something unions feared more than corporate betrayal: internal collapse. Members began questioning leadership. Disputes erupted between locals and national chapters. A growing number of workers began calling for decertification votes, arguing that the union had become a puppet of corporate manipulation. The emotional toll was catastrophic, not just because of lost jobs, but because of lost faith. When even the union can't protect you, who can? And as Canadian labor began to fracture, a new storm was forming just across the river. One that proved this betrayal wasn't limited by borders. Betrayed on both sides of the border, just as workers in Windsor were boarding up their futures. A near-identical scene was unfolding in Michigan. Another Stellantis facility, another mass layoff, another pause with no return date. And for the first time, workers on both sides of the border realized they were not victims of two separate tragedies. They were pawns in one coordinated play. In group chats and online forums, stories started matching up. American and Canadian workers compared notes, promises made, deadlines pushed, equipment shipped out under the cover of night, rumors that management had already sold off portions of the plants. It didn't matter if you were in Ontario or Ohio. Stellantis had no allegiance to geography. Just a bottom line. Local journalists started digging. The shutdowns had been orchestrated in tandem. Executives had met in Europe months earlier, mapping out exit strategies for both countries while continuing to negotiate new subsidies and tax breaks. It was a masterclass in economic manipulation. The workers were never the priority. Neither was national interest. This was corporate imperialism. Companies moving capital like chess pieces, gutting communities without flinching. The irony? Many of the same political leaders who had championed tariffs as a way to protect jobs were now standing silently, powerless to stop the fallout. And while workers begged for answers, executives were already writing the next chapter from a boardroom in Europe. We dug through documents, leaks, and contracts to get the real story. If you're here for truth, not spin, hit subscribe. The political firestorm. Within hours of the Windsor announcement, Canadian lawmakers took to the podium like generals at war. Their language wasn't diplomatic. It was raw. Stellantis, they said, had betrayed the nation. Ontario's premier accused the automaker of economic treason, and federal ministers called for emergency sessions to investigate foreign interference in Canadian industry. One member of parliament, voice shaking with anger, stood before a packed chamber and declared, "This isn't just a plant closure. This is a coordinated attack on the Canadian worker, and we will respond." The crowd erupted, not with applause, but with a tension that vibrated through the halls of Parliament. American governors panicked. Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, states whose economies still depend on the skeletal remains of old manufacturing, began pleading with the White House. Trump's tariffs, which were pitched as a patriotic stand against globalism, had become an accelerant to industrial collapse. Now those same governors who had once cheered the tariffs were asking for exemptions, loopholes, any lifeline they could use to keep Stellantis from walking away for good. In Washington, the chaos turned inward. Republican senators clashed with Trump loyalists. Democrats blamed corporate greed. Trump himself doubled down, claiming Stellantis had always planned to gut the system, and that the tariffs were just flushing out the traitors. But behind closed doors, even his allies were nervous. The optics were terrible. Factories closing, families suffering, a collapsing industry playing out in real time. But while politicians screamed into microphones, something more dangerous was already happening, out of sight and in silence. Wall Street turns on Stellantis. The first sign came quietly. A downgrade from a mid-tier ratings agency, then another. By the end of the week, Stellantis bonds had been dropped to near junk status. Hedge funds that had once praised the company's agile global footprint began quietly dumping shares. Investment firms that had Stellantis in their top automotive picks suddenly labeled it unrecoverable. And then the real bleeding started. By the third week of fallout, Stellantis had lost over $30 billion in market capitalization. Credit lines evaporated. Suppliers demanded upfront payments. One top-tier hedge fund manager, speaking anonymously to Bloomberg, put it bluntly, "You don't hold on to a bomb after the fuse is lit." It wasn't just stock traders fleeing. Bondholders started offloading debt positions. Municipal pension funds began reallocating. Even European banks that once viewed Stellantis as a flagship of post-merger success pulled back, citing untenable North American exposure. The ripple effects hit instantly. Equipment financing deals were canceled. Real estate leases were frozen. Insurers refused to underwrite long-term risk for facilities still operating in North America. A network of financial trust built over decades collapsed in days. And while the corporate headquarters in Amsterdam issued tone-deaf press releases about transitional excellence, their dealer network was already in open revolt. Because the people closest to the customer, the last line of defense, were the next to fall. The dealer revolt. Across North America, Stellantis dealerships became ghost towns. The empty lots weren't from record sales, they were from halted deliveries. The shutdowns meant suppliers stopped shipping, ports backed up, inventories dried out, and the vehicles that did arrive, they were already overpriced, outdated, or plagued with recalls. In Texas, one Dodge dealer said, "We're sitting on 40 cars and praying someone walks through the door. No marketing campaign in the world can fix this." In Ohio, a Jeep dealership manager threatened legal action, citing breach of contract and loss of expected volume. Emails leaked to the press showed a growing list of dealers preparing lawsuits against the automaker, demanding compensation for missed deliveries, unfilled incentives, and broken promises. Some dealers even discussed severing franchise ties altogether. In a private meeting of dealership owners in Detroit, one Chrysler dealer said, "I've been with them for 30 years, but this is a betrayal I can't sell around." Stellantis had always prided itself on brand loyalty. Jeep was supposed to mean rugged American adventure. Dodge was the muscle of the Midwest. Ram was the truck that wouldn't quit. But when customers showed up looking for test drives and were met with empty lots, weak incentives, and zero clarity, the illusion shattered. Brand trust evaporated. Consumers began associating Stellantis not with capability, but with chaos. And that chaos didn't stay in the showroom. It spilled into TikTok feeds, YouTube exposés, and consumer forums. And that's when the death blow came, not from regulators or investors, but from the people who mattered most, the buyers. Consumers fight back. Within days of the Windsor shutdown, angry customers began posting videos online. A Michigan Jeep fan burned his Wrangler merch on camera, declaring, "They left us, so we're leaving them." TikTok clips racked up millions of views showing unsold Dodge Chargers gathering dust. Former loyalists turned brand ambassadors into whistleblowers. Reddit threads lit up with horror stories, broken dealership promises, warranty denials, unfulfilled recall notices. YouTube auto channels that once hyped Ram trucks now tore them apart. One video titled "Dodge Betrayed America" crossed 1 million views in 48 hours. But this wasn't just internet noise. It was a movement. Data from dealer analytics showed a double-digit drop in online search traffic for Stellantis brands. Customer leads dried up. Referral campaigns flatlined. Even longtime diehards began to shop elsewhere. Toyota, Ford, Hyundai. Anywhere but here. What Stellantis didn't seem to grasp was this: trust isn't a line item. You can't PR your way out of betrayal. Once the public feels lied to, once they connect your brand with job losses, political excuses, and Wall Street panic, it's over. You become the villain, the cautionary tale. Marketing teams scrambled. Budgets were slashed. Internal campaigns were redirected to focus on legacy value and global vision. But none of it worked. Not while buyers were filming empty dealerships and calling them graveyards of American manufacturing. And while executives hid behind quarterly earnings calls and PR teams begged for time, the workers who built the vehicles were still unemployed, still ignored, still grieving. And as the world laughed, the workers were still crying, the layoffs that never ended. In Detroit, the buzzword was Factory Zero. But to the workers laid off from the shuttered plant, it might as well have been named after the number of jobs left behind. It was supposed to be General Motors' showpiece, but Stellantis had its own echo. In Belvidere, Illinois, the Jeep plant that once employed over 4,000 people fell silent. No shift change, no rumbling machines. Just locked gates and overgrown fences. And it didn't stop there. Dozens of towns across North America became economic ghost zones. From Windsor to Warren, from Toledo to Toluca, families once tied to reliable paychecks now lined up at food banks. Local restaurants closed. Daycares emptied. Schools saw budget cuts. Even hospitals reported lower patient counts because laid-off workers weren't getting regular checkups anymore. They couldn't afford to. By spring of 2025, the ripple effect had reached an inflection point. Job loss wasn't a statistic. It was a humanitarian crisis. In Ohio, a family of 5 living on a single income lost everything after the Stellantis layoffs. Their mortgage went into default. Their electricity was cut. And their oldest son, a college student, dropped out to work full-time at a gas station. In Windsor, a former assembly line worker gave a haunting interview. They said we'd be back in 3 weeks. That was 8 months ago. My kids still ask when I'm going back to work. I don't know what to tell them. Local governments, reliant on factory taxes, saw budgets gutted. Snowplows were grounded. Public buses parked. Small towns that once hummed with industrial pride now begged for federal aid. But the most painful part? It was all avoidable. Because the future they were promised never existed. And the illusion was about to unravel, the EV bluff. Stellantis had a vision, at least that's what they told investors. Press releases, flashy keynote speeches, and billion-dollar projections painted a picture of a company racing toward an electric future. But behind the curtain, it was all smoke. Inside Stellantis' electric vehicle division, the reality was brutal. Half-built factories in Indiana and Quebec stood idle. Massive battery facilities, promised with ribbon cuttings and smiling executives, suddenly paused construction. Supplier contracts were frozen. Workers were sent home with vague memos about strategic reevaluation. The most damning revelation came from a series of leaked internal reports. One memo, dated February of 2025, admitted that multiple EV launches had no secure supply chains. Another warned that flagship models didn't meet crash test benchmarks. These weren't minor setbacks, they were systemic failures. Battery suppliers began pulling out of joint ventures. Research teams were reassigned or let go. Contracts with emerging markets were renegotiated, then quietly abandoned. In Mexico, a massive EV site broke ground with fanfare, then sat untouched for 75 days before bulldozers were pulled off the property. But this wasn't just corporate embarrassment. It was financial sabotage, because while they were bluffing, governments were pouring billions into the illusion. And that illusion? It was about to detonate. The multi-billion-dollar mirage. In the years leading up to the collapse, Stellantis secured billions in subsidies, grants, and tax incentives from both US and Canadian governments. Politicians lined up to take photos with executives, praising green investments and job creation. Public money flowed like champagne. $900 million for one plant, $1.4 billion for another. It felt like a win. Until it wasn't. An independent audit later revealed the disturbing truth. Much of the money had vanished. Not into fraud, not into offshore accounts, but into vapor. Temporary labor contracts, promotional material, rented equipment, consultant fees, shell LLCs that passed funds back and forth between internal divisions until no one could trace where the dollars actually went. One investigative journalist followed the paper trail on a $500 million Canadian subsidy. The plant it funded was supposed to bring 3,000 jobs. It brought 27. The rest? Outsourced, delayed, or canceled. A whistleblower from Stellantis' finance division came forward and said there was never a hiring plan, just a funding plan. That was the real product. States and provinces that handed over land, tax holidays, and infrastructure grants suddenly had nothing to show. In Michigan, the governor's office scrambled to revise statements after it was revealed that a promised EV launch had been shelved months earlier, despite the company still receiving state incentives. Meanwhile, suppliers went unpaid. Battery manufacturers who had scaled up to meet the expected demand filed for bankruptcy. Tooling companies and small parts firms were left with unpaid invoices stretching into the millions. Stellantis had pulled off a financial magic trick. Billions in, nothing out. And as governments and small businesses scrambled to assess the damage, another foundational piece of the puzzle was breaking. The supply chain wasn't bending anymore. It was snapping. The global supply chain snap. You can't build anything when the foundation vanishes. And Stellantis had just pulled the rug out from under an entire continent. It started quietly. A lithium supplier in Manitoba reported that a long-term contract with Stellantis had been canceled without warning. Then a copper mine in Peru said the same. By the time a cobalt deal in the Congo collapsed, it was clear Stellantis was bailing on its supply lines. But the devastation wasn't isolated to far-off mines. In the American Midwest, parts factories began to shutter. Hundreds of small firms that specialized in precision components for Jeep and Dodge vehicles laid off workers en masse. In Indiana, a third-generation manufacturer of wiring harnesses went dark after 76 years in business. They blamed one thing: Stellantis broke the contract. In Mexico, a logistics company filed suit after Stellantis backed out of a 10-year shipping deal. In Canada, 2 machining firms began liquidation proceedings. Everywhere Stellantis had touched, there was now silence. It was a chain reaction. From mine to motor mount, from software to steel, Stellantis had not just abandoned the assembly line, it had shattered the spine of supply. But the most damning blow wasn't technical. It was cultural. Suppliers, once proud to be affiliated with Jeep or Ram, began scrubbing the Stellantis name from their marketing material. Investors removed the stock from EV portfolios. Even trade publications hesitated to include Stellantis in industry forecasts. Because now, the collapse wasn't just happening. It was becoming contagious. The auto industry stops caring. When automakers gather to shape the future, there are always names you expect to see: Ford, Toyota, Hyundai, General Motors. For decades, Stellantis, under one name or another, was part of that club. Whether it was Chrysler pioneering minivans or Jeep defining rugged American design, their brands had always commanded attention. But in the spring of 2025, something changed. Invitations to strategic conferences started arriving without Stellantis on the docket. Panels on electric infrastructure made no mention of their vehicles. And then came the fleet contracts. In a sweeping update to government procurement policies across the United States and Canada, new EV incentive packages were released. The winners: Ford's Lightning division, Hyundai's Ioniq lineup, and Toyota's latest battery models. Stellantis was nowhere on the list. Entire departments had worked for years to secure those partnerships. They were simply excluded. Then came the sting of irrelevance. When Ford and Tesla finalized a joint agreement on universal supercharger access, the industry took note. By the time Hyundai and Kia followed suit, charging compatibility became the new battlefield. Stellantis, still caught in the internal debates and tech delays, missed the moment. Now, consumers began asking a fatal question: why buy a vehicle that's already falling behind? Even private sector fleet buyers began to defect. Delivery firms, utility companies, and government municipalities started removing Dodge ProMasters and Ram trucks from future orders. Executives at these companies cited uncertainty, instability, and a lack of trust in Stellantis' long-term vision. Dealerships, still sitting on outdated inventory, were ghosted by national procurement teams. New car salespeople reported losing long-time accounts because fleet buyers didn't want to explain why they were still choosing a brand that might not exist in 2 years. However, the moment that truly marked the shift happened not in a factory, not in a boardroom, but on a spreadsheet. During an investor meeting in late May of 2025, a Wall Street analyst published a forecast of the top 10 EV players by 2030. Ford was there. Toyota was there. Even startups like Rivian and VinFast made the list. But it wasn't the headlines that would deliver the final verdict. It was what happened behind closed doors that broke everything. The day Stellantis lost the room. It began with a resignation, then another, and then another. Within 1 month, 5 senior vice presidents submitted their departures. Legal counsel followed, then several heads of engineering. Human resources barely had time to process the exits before the next wave came. Internal leaks revealed a disturbing atmosphere, one dominated by fear, burnout, and psychological exhaustion. A confidential report from the HR department detailed rising mental health claims, employee assistance, hotline spikes, and entire teams operating without direction. One executive wrote in a resignation letter, "This is no longer a company, it's a stress machine." Another leaked email said bluntly, "No one wants to be here." Projects that once had million-dollar budgets were paused indefinitely or quietly canceled. When reporters tried to get updates on Stellantis' much-touted EV plant in Indiana, the only response from headquarters was, "We'll have more to share soon." They never did. Suppliers stopped picking up the phone. Job applicants disappeared. Even talent recruiters stopped calling. And in the middle of the storm, Carlos Tavares vanished from public view. Some said he was locked in negotiations with European investors. Others claimed he was considering retirement. A few said he had simply stopped showing up. Yet on June 17th, the final headline dropped. Reuters ran it first. Stellantis board initiates CEO transition. There was no farewell speech, no public appearance, just silence. And in that silence, the company's last pillar crumbled. The final humiliation. You don't know when it starts, but you always know when it ends. The final humiliation didn't come in the form of a scandal. It wasn't a lawsuit or a bankruptcy filing. It was something worse: erasure. At the 2025 Global Auto Innovation Summit, Stellantis was not listed as a speaker. Their booth stood empty. At the EV Leadership Forum in Berlin, Toyota, Ford, BYD, and Hyundai dominated every panel. Stellantis omitted from the agenda. An industry-wide EV benchmarking report listed 10 key manufacturers defining the next decade. Stellantis didn't make the list. Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, Ram, all gone from the conversation. The final insult came when Motor Trend released their annual EV awards. No Stellantis model was even nominated. Not for performance, not for design, not even for innovation. It was the first time in over 20 years that the company had been completely absent from consideration. Former employees watched the industry walk away in real time. On LinkedIn, professionals who once proudly listed Stellantis began removing it from their profiles. Dealerships replaced Stellantis banners with independent service signs. Entire forums deleted Stellantis discussion threads because no one was posting anymore. And then came the final silence. At a private roundtable of CEOs held in Tokyo, a journalist asked about legacy auto brands and the future of electric infrastructure. One panelist smirked and said, "Well, some legacies don't make it." No one laughed. No one mentioned Stellantis, because now even the mockery was too generous. From Chrysler's century of muscle cars, to Dodge's iconic rumble, to Jeep's global badge of freedom, it all faded into the fog. Not with a bang, not with a lawsuit, only with silence. And this time, Stellantis had no one left to blame. What do you think? Was this the final nail for Stellantis? Or is there still a way back? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to stay ahead of the stories no one else is telling, subscribe now.